that never been deciphered. And see, you have to understand that the ancient Egyptians never wrote a history of themselves. That's very, very clean, very clear.
Okay, then let's talk about, because we've dealt with that whole period now of the falsification and the creation of a history, where we can see now how one can put themselves in history. But let's begin to look at the Europeans themselves and talk about it. Perhaps you can explain, when does the European impact the ancient Egyptians? I mean, we talk about the Mayans. I'm looking at this book, and they talk about the Mayans, and they take Greece back to the year 2000, and they give a chronology of Greece, beginning with the Mayans and bringing all the way up to this great and marvelous civilization that they built.
What they call the Minoan civilization. Suppose it started on the island that's called Crete today.
Correct.
Okay? The ancient Egyptians lived on that island, because that's right in the Mediterranean, so many miles from Egypt. Okay? The ancient Egyptians lived in Greece and brought a high civilization in Greece before the Greeks came into Greece. See, the Greeks that are known today, or the people that are known today as the Greeks, came out of Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania, Hungary, etc., into Greece at a certain time. But prior to that, the ancient Egyptians created a high civilization over there. They call that civilization the Mycenaean civilization. The Greeks and the Romans are one and the same. The Roman Greeks migrated into the country that's known as Italy, but the ancient Egyptians created a high civilization prior to these Roman Greeks getting over there, and they are calling that civilization the Etruscan civilization. These are names that are used to camouflage the true identity and the true glory and the true history of the ancient Egyptians. Etruscans, Mycenaeans, Minoans, etc., etc. Okay? With these names, they can attach all kinds of stories to it and write up certain things in books to take you away from the ancient Egyptian, or the glorification of the ancient Egyptian. You mentioned about the Greeks in 200 BC having a form of civilization. That's not true, simply because you cannot have a civilization coming from anybody who does not have a writing system. The Greeks never had a form of writing. They never had an alphabet. So during the time of antiquity, there's never been an institution that ever came out of Greece. If one argues against that, then you name me what institution that came out of Greece during the time of antiquity. The ancient Egyptians were invaded by the Greeks under Alexander the Greek in 332 BCE. That was the first time in world history that a European ever came in contact with the ancient Egyptians in Egypt, in Africa. And that's where all of it began from that point, coming up to 1999.
Were the Persians Europeans?
Never been a Persian to be a European.
So you're saying that whole thing about the Persians is a lie?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's
see what they're trying to do is to, like I told you before, all history is written to establish and sustain a Jew in biblical literature in human form. That's how they write it up. Okay? Now, they create a Persian out of a Cyrus II the Great, okay, who was supposed to be a Persian king who rescued the Jews out of Babylon in 587 and took them back and sent them back into Judea to build their second temple. This is all biblical. They said Nebuchadnezzar took the Jews out of Judea and put them into slavery into Babylon. And Cyrus II the Great came along, who was a Persian king, came along and freed them from this bondage in 587. You see that? So now they need a Persian of any kind to try to sustain this pseudo story of this lie that is told about Jews and this concocted history that they have created. So there's never been any Persians. See, if you go to a book or go to the Encyclopedia Judaica, it's your nearest library, and you look up the Great Synagogue in there. In the literature that's called the Great Synagogue, you know what they tell you in that literature? They know nothing about no Persians. See? You see?
All right, I just want to jump ahead because okay. Now, if the Mayans and the Etruscans and the Persians didn't exist and the Babylons and all that, then let's try to reconstruct this European history. They began to come in as Greeks. What did they bring? What kind of people were they? I mean, they had to be great fighters. They overthrew the Egyptians. Let's talk about them. Who were they? How did they overturn such a powerful civilization?
Well, first place you got to understand this, Clemson, is that the Greeks was uncivilized savages who had no writing system or a form of writing. They were uncivilized. There's never been an institution that ever came out of Greece. That you have to understand. Okay? So what did they bring with them? They didn't, let's say, use force on the ancient Egyptians, so far as we know, and what we call force today. Okay, such as coming in, shooting, killing, etc., etc. You know, that's what we know of today. Okay, but what they did, they came in by way of a wave of Europeans in flooding the area over there. Okay, and they began to take over the control of ancient Egypt and the ancient Egyptians. The ones that resisted them, they're the ones that got destroyed. Okay, and used as an example for others to stay in line. Okay, but see, the ancient Egyptians, you got to remember, never had an army, nor were there any jails in ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians had a near perfect government that has ever existed on earth. They had no jails or army. Now, to prove that they never had an army, that anytime you go to an institution that displays ancient Egyptian artifacts, you will never find war weapons in that display. So they had no armies or jails. You have jails because a government or the head of the government is corrupt. That's what jails are for corrupt people. So if your head of your government is corrupt, quite naturally the citizens of that government is going to be corrupt. So you need jails to put people in who get out of line. Okay? So therefore the ancient Egyptians did not have any armies. The question that you asked, what happened to them? I'm asked that question all the time. I answer this way. What happened to the American Indian when the European come over here? He didn't have an army or jails. The Europeans took over his land area. What happened to the South American Indian when the Europeans came in that part of the world? He didn't have an army or jails to stop the Europeans. What happened to the Indians of India who the Europeans came in and took over and caused a man that is known in history as Mahatma Gandhi to come into existence to try to throw them off? What happened to the Chinese when the Europeans came in and occupied Hong Kong for 150 years? They just gave it back to China last year, 98. What happened to the Aborigines of Australia when the Europeans came over there? So it's just not the